Good afternoon. This is Daniel here with Cop Watch TV, and we're going to go ahead and break down some of the most important and interesting cases in policing from the last week. I want to thank everyone for being here in our live show. And while I'm going through some of these cases, if you have different opinions or thoughts on some of these cases, definitely go ahead and put those in the chat. One of our favorite things to do is, as we're kind of breaking down these cases is going through, is not only answering questions from our viewers, but also going back and forth and discussing and debating these cases with our viewers. It's always interesting to see what people think about these controversial cases. And today we have 3 of them, and we're going to go through all of them. Want to welcome again everyone in. Looks like we have Sarah from Charleston, South Carolina. Sharon is from North Carolina. Want to welcome everyone in. If you haven't already, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel and make sure that you share it with friends and family. You know, we usually do the show on Fridays around 12, just after 12 o'clock Mountain Time on Fridays. Also, you can go ahead and follow me over at Police Law News, just about everywhere where I cover these cases pretty much on a daily basis. All right, so this first case that we're going to talk about, really over the last couple days, this is the case that's pretty much been in the news, or if you follow, issues in policing on really any social media site, this is the case that most people have been talking about. And, honestly, this is the case that people should be talking about, because this is going to be an officer-involved shooting where the police officer made a general mistake in the moment, and a 15-year-old ended up dead. So this case happened in San Bernardino, California, but it happened a while ago. It happened on September 27th in 2022. So the reason that we're talking about this case now is because there's some video footage that's been leaked to a local reporter in California that hadn't been released so far. So essentially, this entire time, just about a year and a half since this case happened, that we haven't been able to see really any of the video footage from this. And I should just say before we get into it that when it comes to body camera footage and any footage that is from the police, that it's different state by state. California has one of the worst state laws for body camera footage. That's why cases like the Pelosi case and this case, things like that. That's why these cases, it takes a long time to get body camera footage. There are some states that are great when it comes to body camera footage, but however, California is not one of them. It's taken a year and a half to get any footage on this, so let's get into it. So here's what happened in this case. Essentially, there was a man, his name is Anthony Graziano, and he had a 15-year-old daughter named Savannah. Now, Anthony and the mother of Savannah were not together. They had been living separately, and most of the time, Savannah had been living with her father. Well, there was some type of domestic dispute that happened, and during that domestic dispute, the father, Anthony, ended up killing Savannah's mother. After the killing, Anthony took Savannah hostage. Now, we say that it's kind of what some of the initial reporting of this is after the body of the mother was found, is that there was, because she was only 15, there was an Amber Alert that was issued for Savannah. So there was an Amber Alert that was issued for her. But again, before this homicide occurred, she really had been living with her father. But obviously, because there was a violent crime that took place, there was an Amber Alert that was issued. So pretty much that same day, what happened was deputies in San Bernardino, California, they were able to locate the car that both Anthony and Savannah were driving in. Now, they were the only 2 people in the car. Police officers tried to initiate a traffic stop, not only to get Anthony into custody for the investigation from the homicide, but also to make sure that Savannah is all right. While the officers tried to conduct a traffic stop, the vehicle did not stop. Essentially, this turned into a police chase. Now, police officers, especially in states like California, they're not going to chase for a whole lot of things. If it's a property crime, if there isn't any victim, or a smaller type of crime, police officers most of the time aren't going to be able to chase. However, a case like this where it's a violent crime like a homicide and there's an Amber Alert for a 15-year-old, those are the types of incidents that police officers pretty much in any jurisdiction that you can think of are going to engage in a vehicle pursuit. So that's exactly what they did. During the vehicle pursuit, police officers started to take fire from that vehicle. Now, these are accounts not just from police officers, but also from independent witnesses. And here's what they said. What the people said is that, while the police officers were engaged in this foot pursuit, that, shots were being fired from the front passenger side of the vehicle at police officers. Multiple different police cars were hit. During this, one police vehicle was actually disabled by the gunfire. So, the person who was shooting in the passenger seat at police officers was shooting a lot of bullets at police officers during this chase. Now, again, there were only two people in the vehicle. Anthony was driving the car, the father, and Savannah was in the passenger seat. So this 15-year-old who, had this Amber Alert issued, she is wearing tactical gear, she has tactical pants, and she has on a helmet. And she is shooting at police officers from the passenger side of the vehicle. Now, as a police officer, you have to be thinking, okay, well, what's going on here? Is she also an offender? Is she doing this because he's forcing her to do it? There's a lot of things. But again, she's also a 15-year-old who is in the car with someone who just killed her mother. So there's a lot that has to go on when it comes to the lot police officers are probably thinking about. But once she starts shooting at police officers have to recognize her as a threat, even though she's a 15-year-old girl. So they have to see her as a threat because she's shooting at them. So eventually this happened. What ends up happening in this case is pretty much what happens in most vehicle pursuits where the police officers say, we're not going to stop chasing you. Sorry. Well, and the vehicle ended up crashing and the vehicle was disabled. Once the vehicle was disabled, Anthony from the driver's seat ended up getting in a gunfight with police officers. And during this gunfight, Savannah, who is still in the front passenger seat of the vehicle, she was not firing at police officers. And again, she was in the front passenger seat of the vehicle. There was a police car and a deputy who was near. There was a deputy who essentially his car was positioned just in front of their car, and he was positioned closer to the passenger side. So he was physically the closest one to Savannah's position. And what he did is, basically Savannah is in this car and she's pretty much, in a terrible position because at this point, she is not shooting at police officers, but her father sitting right next to her is involved in a gunfight with cops. So what a deputy does, and it's not an unreasonable decision that this deputy made. Please put in the comments if you disagree. What the deputy did is the deputy started to yell at Savannah to get out of the car. He yells at her to get out of the car and essentially to get down on the ground and to lay down on the ground next to the car. So she does that. She follows the instructions and she does that. Now, again, during this, deputies are still involved in a gunfight with Anthony, who's in the driver's seat of the vehicle. So even though she's laying next to the passenger side of the car, that still isn't a very safe place. So what the same deputy does is he actually gives her different instructions. So he basically tells her to run towards him, to come towards him, to try to get to safety. Now, the reason that the deputy did this isn't because he had any ill feelings towards this 15-year-old. He didn't want her to get hurt. He wasn't trying to trick her. I mean, legit, because to me, intent matters. What the intent of the deputy was say, okay, Savannah is in a terrible spot. How can we get her to a better spot? And the deputy gave her instructions to basically run to him. Now, here's the problem with this. And the problem with this is that this is a chaotic scene and there's police officers basically fanned out all across in front of that vehicle. Just like I said, this deputy was positioned in front of the vehicle, but closer to the passenger side. There were police officers who were pretty much on the other side. If you can imagine, there were police officers pretty much on the other side, engaging with the driver. So on the driver's side of the vehicle. So when the deputy gave those, otherwise not necessarily a bad idea, like pretty reasonable instructions for Savannah to come to safety and try to run towards the cops so that she would be safe. Unfortunately, what ended up happening is that another deputy who was on the other side, closer to the driver's side, was not within earshot of those orders that the one deputy gave to this 15-year-old. So essentially, the other deputy didn't know that this was happening. So from the other deputy's point of view, here's what he sees. He has a 15-year-old who had just been shooting at police officers, and now he sees her get up and run towards the cops. in the moment, that deputy thought that she was still a threat. He didn't know if she was still armed. He thought that she was a threat. So what that deputy did is he ended up shooting and killing her, and she basically died right there. Also, during this officer-involved shooting, obviously Anthony, he died as well. So it's a pretty terrible case. It's a tragedy. So because as the deputy was shooting at Savannah, as the deputy was shooting at her, the deputy who gave her those initial commands or instructions to come towards him, he starts yelling like, stop shooting at her, stop shooting at her. But that wasn't, that was relayed a little bit too late. Ryan says, I'm lying to these people. Hey, Ryan. So all the reports from this case are not just from the media, from police, but also from independent witnesses, are that Savannah was shooting at deputies from the passenger seat of the car during the car chase. However, once the car chase stopped and the vehicle was still, all the reports are that there was no more shooting from Savannah. So that's what all of the reporting has been on this. So that's what I'm reporting. If that reporting is incorrect, if that's not, and I also watched some surveillance video. That's what the surveillance video shows as well. The video that we have on this case. So that's what it says. If later on, if something ends up, something else ends up being true, or there's more information, I'll definitely correct. But as of right now, that's what the best information on this is. And I'm not making this up. That's just what the information on this is. So basically this is just a mistake by the officer. This is a miscommunication from the police officers, because obviously the deputy who fired the shots, he didn't wake up that day and say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go ahead and shoot a 15-year-old girl who isn't armed, who isn't a threat. So that's obviously not what happened. So in the moment, the deputy thought that person, the deputy thought that she was a threat. And so we have to look at it this way. Was it reasonable for the deputy to think that she was a threat? I'm really curious to see what your thoughts are on this. And I'm going to say, yes, it probably was reasonable for the deputy to believe that she was a threat in the moment, because she had been previously firing at police officers. Now, so what we have to do, and yes, no, she wasn't shooting at police officers at the time. So when we look at cases like this, we have to say, okay, what could the police officers have done differently? Because again, even though it was probably reasonable for the officer to think that she was some kind of a threat, she had been shooting at police, and now she's running towards cops. He wasn't in earshot, so he wasn't able to hear what the other deputy said. So how can we fix this in the future? And really, the only thing that we can do in a situation like this is really to have good first-line supervisors or incident commanders on scene. So whenever you have something like this, when you have people who are in a situation like this, really, let's see what Cajun Randy says. You report that the deputies thought, but you can't know what the deputies thought or even thinking at all. Well, we do know a little bit, Randy. So the reporting that we have on this is that, okay, let's start here, Randy. So we know that she was shooting at deputies. So if she was previously shooting at deputies during this incident, is it reasonable? Let's talk about what's reasonable, Randy. Is it reasonable for a police officer to think someone could be a threat if they had just been shooting at cops? Like, I don't think it's a giant leap to say, yeah, this person was just shooting at us a couple minutes ago. Now she's not. Fantastic. But like she just had been. Is it reasonable? Is it in the realm of being reasonable to think that this person could be a threat? I mean, I'm going to say yes. If you disagree, that's okay. And again, I wish this didn't happen. So, really having an incident commander on scene. And when you have a situation like this, that's why training for police officers is so important. Because when you have a situation like this and the bullets start flying and you have multiple people inside of a car, there has to be a plan that everybody knows about. Everybody on scene knows about. Okay, here's what we're going to do. We have someone who's in the passenger seat. If they're not a threat, we're going to put them here. We have someone, we're going to put them here. So it's not just enough for one person it's not just enough for one deputy in the moment to give instructions that, again, maybe it could be reasonable in the moment to give those instructions, but to not let the other police officers know over the radio, hey, I'm going to get the female out. We're going to try to get her here. We're going to try to get her behind the car. We're going to give her instructions to do that. So I think that's really where the failure was. And again, if that's my opinion, like that's where the failure was, that the failure was in the communication from the deputy who told Savannah to go somewhere else, but didn't tell the other deputies on scene that was going to be the new plan. And then I honestly think that's what the problem was with this case. I don't think it was unreasonable. I don't think it was unreasonable in the moment for the deputy to think that she could be a threat. So that's why I say that training is so important. And here's my problem with incidents like this, and for people who criticize police. We should criticize police officers in an effort to get better, but the criticism shouldn't be dishonest. And here's what I mean by this, because often the same people who are criticizing the actions of the police officers are the exact same people who want to defund police officers. They want to defund police. They also the same types of people who in Atlanta are trying to get rid of Cop City, which is basically a giant training ground for police officers. So yes, police officers typically police officers, maybe you can go an entire career and never have a situation like this. So yes, military equipment and ballistic shields and, Bearcats and stuff like that. Maybe you could say, well, police officers really don't need like those kinds of equipment that is militarizing the local police department. Again, I just retired from a pretty big city. I worked for 20 years, and in 20 years, I never was in a situation like this, thankfully. But again, now we see that police officers are. So, you can't on one hand say we don't want to give funding for police officers for equipment and training, and then when a situation like this, expect the police officers to act completely perfectly. So this is a case where I do not expect the police officer in this case to be charged. I don't think that the police officer should be charged. I think that really this is a training issue. That's what I think this is. Probably some kind of a civil suit. I do not expect the police officer to be charged in this case, because basically, again, what we're looking at, essentially, now every state law is going to be a little bit different when it comes to when you can charge police officers, but typically in general, what we're looking at is, okay, in the moment, did the police officer perceive a deadly threat? Meaning a deadly threat is anything that could cause great bodily injury or death. And you go, okay, so if a police officer perceived that, was that perception reasonable? And that's basically what we're looking at. Like I said, in every state, the language is going to be a little bit different when it comes to when you can charge a police officer. But, because we're not going to research those laws for every single case in all 50 states, we'll just talk about it generally, like, were the actions of the police officer reasonable? So more on point with this case, the officer who saw Savannah, who she's in camo pants, she has a helmet on, she had recently been shooting at police officers. The officer didn't hear that she was told to run towards the cops. He sees her go from laying down to running towards cops. In the moment, is that a reasonable thing for him to think that she poses a deadly threat? And I'm saying probably. And again, I don't love this officer-involved shooting, because obviously with 2020 hindsight, which is, how we can talk about this case, but I think we should also realize that just because we have the luxury and the privilege of talking about this case in 2020 hindsight, the deputies in the moment who were having bullets flying at them, they didn't have that luxury. And I think that's an important distinction to make. All right, let me answer a couple questions or read a couple comments on this case. So Ryan says, what was she a threat with? Yeah, so she was shooting at police officers during the car chase. She was a threat then. Again, because a handgun can be concealed, it's something that easily could have been in her pocket. Again, with 2020 hindsight, we know now that she wasn't shooting at police officers. Well, again, we have the luxury of knowing that now. Ben says, was she armed when she left the vehicle? I don't think so. I'm not 100% sure if she had a gun on her or not, Ben, but what I can say is she did not have a gun in her hand, and once the vehicle crashed and her dad was involved in a gunfight with cops, she did not participate in that gunfight. And the officer who was giving her directions and commands and really trying to save her life and get her to a safer spot, that deputy who was the closest to her recognized that. Let's see. Cajun says, my point is no one knows what anybody else thinks, only what they say they thought. Yeah, that's correct. I don't know exactly what the police officers thought, Randy, 100%. And unless an officer gives a statement that's public, I'm not going to know. All I can say is these are the facts on the ground. And, because I was a cop for 20 years, I'm kind of putting in my experience in there, that if someone was just shooting at police officers, that it would be reasonable for a police officer to think that that same exact person during that same exact incident could be a danger, could be a threat to police officers. I don't think that is a huge leap. I want to thank you all for the comments and the questions on that case. Again, this isn't a case that I love. This isn't a case where if anything, sometimes there are police cases and incidents and officer-involved shootings that happen where you go, hey, listen, you see what the police officers there? That is exactly what we want cops to do in every single situation like that. This is the opposite of that. This is the opposite. This is the case where we see what happened. We go, holy shit, what can we do as a police department? Or this happened in California. What can a police department 1,000 miles away say? Hey, holy shit, if this happens, do we have something in place to make sure this doesn't happen? And that's really what police departments and trainers and police leaders all across the country should be doing, looking at incidents like this and saying, oh my God, if our officers get into a situation like this where there's a gunfight, but one of the people in the car is not participating in that gunfight, we want to extract them and get them to safety. What's the plan to do that? What's the SOP? What's the training? How do we accomplish that? Because the goal from police officers is to save lives. And I'm just going to say that, in situations like this, that the police are the good guys. The criminals are the bad guys because intent matters. It just does. There is a moral difference between police officers who make a mistake while they're trying to save lives and criminals who are trying to hurt people and then get away with their crimes. There's a moral difference between those two things, and we shouldn't forget it. All right, so the next case that we're going to talk about is also someone who died during a use of force with police officers, but it wasn't a shooting. So this is a case where a police officer utilized a less lethal weapon system, and the person ended up dying. So cases like this are pretty rare, and that's why we're going to go ahead and talk about it. So this happened in Fullerton, California. So I know I'm covering a bunch of California cases today. I am not local in California. It just happens that some of the most interesting cases from the last week happened in California. So this happened in Fullerton, California, involving a man, a 50-year-old named Alejandro Rios. Essentially, basically, here's what happened is employees at a McDonald's called for police officers in Fullerton, California, and the report to 911 is that this man, Alejandro Rios, was essentially causing a disturbance in the McDonald's, and he was scaring customers and employees, so they called police officers. The police officers in Fullerton arrived to the scene, and when they got there, they saw that Mr. Rios was standing outside of the McDonald's, kind of yelling and talking to himself, and he had taken his shirt off. And I'm just gonna take a side note right there. There is no situation ever that a police officer said, oh, good, this crazy guy who is screaming and yelling just took his shirt off. That means things are about to get a little more calm. No police officer ever thinks that. So when someone takes their shirt off, that's usually an indication that things are going to go to shit. Taking your shirt off when you make contact with police officers is not a sign that like you're about to calm down and be a reasonable human. All right. So cops arrive. They see Mr. Rios is standing outside of the McDonald's. He's yelling and screaming, and he has taken his shirt off. Police officers identify themselves. They tell him to, get on the ground. They're going to try to place him into custody. And at that point, what Mr. Rios does is he takes off his belt and he starts swinging the belt around like he's a Ninja Turtle. So he's swinging his belt around. So now police officers have a couple decisions to make. So now they have this guy who's swinging a belt. So before he was swinging the belt, there were multiple police officers there. So before he's swinging a belt, we have an individual who's unarmed. So it would be completely reasonable and within policy for two police officers to approach him. Each officer try to grab an arm and then, use some type of use of force that really only involves empty hand tactics and doesn't involve any other weapon systems. That would be a completely reasonable thing. However, once Mr. Rios grabs the belt and he starts swinging it around, that really isn't an option anymore. That's not an option anymore. anymore for police officers to go hands-on, because he's swinging around a belt all crazy. If an officer gets hit with that in the face, they could lose an eye again. And then, so now let's say he hits a police officer and he smacks him in the eye, and you have this huge eye injury. Well, now you have another police officer there who's, probably not going to try to go hands-on anymore. That could escalate to an officer-involved shooting, which again, all of this is to avoid an officer-involved shooting. So the police officers, basically what they decide to do is to use their less lethal weapon systems. Now, I should say that less lethal weapon systems are not non-lethal, meaning anything can kill you. However, it's probably not going to, right? So we hear cases where people do die after they are tased or after they are shot with a beanbag shotgun or a 40 mil. So we hear cases like that where that does happen, but statistically, it is really, really rare that might happen. Again, especially when it comes to like tasers. Again, as a police officer, I was tased 2 times in the academy. If the taser was going to kill people, they wouldn't, do it to police cadets in the academy. But again, so it's not non-lethal. People say non-lethal. That's correct. It's less than lethal because anything there's a statistically low probability that a turtle can kill you, but it still might. So it's not non-lethal. It's less lethal force option. So what police officer tries to do, what a police officers do in this case is they basically use 2 different less lethal weapon systems. The first officer tries to utilize a taser, and he fires a taser at Mr. Rios. That's not an unreasonable thing to do. That's a pretty good decision. The police officer tries to use the taser. He fires a taser. It does not have the desired effect, which means it doesn't work. And that could be for a couple reasons. So the way that a taser works is when you shoot out a taser, it basically shoots out 2 different prongs. Now, in order for it to essentially work, to have an effect, both prongs have to hit the individual. So both prongs have to hit the individual. I'm going to take a side note. Cajun Randy, cadets in the academy are not elderly people. I agree, Cajun Randy. I went through the police academy at 22 years old. However, the oldest guy in my academy class was a guy named Garcia, old Navy guy, Garcia, and he was 59 years old. And he got tased twice and he was fine. Though 59 isn't elderly, but I should just say that, there are older people in the academy. So both prongs have to hit. Well, you can imagine that now we have a moving target trying to hit it with 2 different prongs from a distance. It's going to be a difficult shot to make. So for whatever reason, the taser was not effective. So then another officer on the other side had a beanbag shotgun. Now, beanbag shotguns are less lethal weapon systems. Typically, they're painful as shit. Again, so beanbag shotguns, so police cadets are not shot with beanbag shotguns in the academy because it can break skin, it can break a bone, it can cause a giant bruising. So yeah, a beanbag shotgun, it's going to fucking hurt, but again, it's less lethal. It's probably not going to kill you. I mean, what I can say is, I just retired from a pretty big police department after 20 years. Police officers use beanbag shotguns all the time. In 20 years, not one person was killed by a beanbag shotgun in my police department in 20 years. So again, it's pretty rare that it happens. So what happened was the police officer fired multiple beanbag shotgun rounds. I think it was 2 or 3 beanbag shotgun rounds at Mr. Rios. In between each firing, the officer was giving Mr. Rios commands to get on the ground, drop the belt, things like that. And what I can say about this case is as soon as Mr. Rios did fall to the ground and drop the belt, no more force was utilized, which is good. That's what we want to see. Here's what we want to see from police officers. We want police officers to use necessary and reasonable force until there isn't a threat. So sometimes, and we'll get into this in the next case because this is the exact issue that I'm going to talk about in the next case. But for what we see a lot of times is that police officers use force, and after they use force, they just keep using force, and they don't stop, pause, and evaluate if the situation changed. But the officers in this case, they actually did that. He didn't just fire like beanbag round after beanbag round. He fired a beanbag round, commands, beanbag round, commands, and as soon as Mr. Rios fell to the ground and dropped the belt, no more beanbag rounds were fired, and that's a good thing. That's what we want to see from police officers, to evaluate every use of force to make sure that the situation is the same and that there still is an active threat. So Mr. Rios did fall to the ground, and basically where this goes is he was shot in the chest with the beanbag shotgun round. He was shot in the chest. There were some significant injuries to his chest, and he ended up dying. So this is a case where he he did pass away, and the injuries from the beanbag shotgun were part of the reason why. So again, these are less lethal, not non-lethal. So obviously, the police officer wasn't trying to kill Mr. Rios. If the police officer didn't utilize deadly force. I mean, you have to think about it this way. I mean, there's cases in baseball where kids are playing baseball and they're hit in the chest with a baseball or a softball or a bat in the wrong essentially in the wrong way, and somehow kids die like that. So this kind of stuff does happen. Now, I should say that when it comes to less lethal weapon systems, including the beanbag shotgun, there are target areas. Essentially, what that means is, like, if you're a police officer, hey, like, where are you supposed to shoot the person at? Now, again, that can change if there's a moving target. And Mr. Rios was moving. He was moving around, swinging a belt. So he wasn't just standing there still. But essentially, where police officers are not supposed to intentionally target for a beanbag shotgun is the chest, the groin, and the head. Again, if you have a moving target, you could be aiming for his arm, but since he's swinging and moving, yes, it's possible that you might hit something else. So that does happen. But yeah, he was shot in the chest. I don't know if part of it was because, typically when stuff like this happens, a lot of times people have drugs on board as well, or, I don't know if the fact that he didn't have a shirt on, I'm not sure if that was also part of it, but he did die from his injuries. And, so what I expect from a case like this, and really the reason that I'm covering this is because a lot of times when there's something like this, when something that, really wasn't, Kuro says, how on earth did it penetrate the skin? So beanbag shotgun rounds can penetrate the skin. They can penetrate the skin. They can cause bleeding. They typically don't go into your body and stuff like that. But they can penetrate the skin and cause some bleeding. Most of the time, what I've seen it typically doesn't, and it just causes bruising. But what's been described in the news about this case is they described it as significant injuries. I think that was actually the press release from Fullerton, California, is the way that they worded it. So that's why I use those specific words. So kind of what I expect from cases like this is that there is going to be some kind of a backlash, that there's going to be some attorney somewhere, that there's going to be some activist somewhere who's going to say, look at this case. A beanbag shotgun just killed this guy. All this guy was, he was an asshole. All he was doing was screaming and yelling outside of a McDonald's, swinging a belt around, and the police officers, this dangerous weapon system killed them. Now, of course, when people say that, they're not taking into account, okay, well, actually, this has been used 50,000 times, and it's only I made that number up, and it's only the percentage of people dying is really, really low. And then you go, okay, well, what's the other option for police officers? Again, you can't go hands-on. You don't want them to use the beanbag shotgun. You don't want them to use the taser. You don't want them to use the 40 mil. So what option do police officers have between going hands-on and a handgun, right? We have these weapons in the middle that, again, nothing's perfect, but they're better than only having the options of empty hands and a handgun. And I'm gonna give an example of why these less lethal weapon systems, not only are they important, but almost equally as important are the policies from police departments that allow police officers to use these weapon systems. And if anyone disagrees with me here, definitely go ahead and put it in the chat, because I'm really curious to see if people have other opinions on this. My opinion is that when it comes to a police department use of force policy, that the use of these less lethal weapon systems, the beanbag shotgun, the taser, and the 40 millimeter, that police officers should have, a latitude, that there should be a pretty big area where police, a lot of different situations where police officers are allowed to use these weapon systems. Because here's my argument. If you constrict when police officers can use these weapon systems and really restrict when cops can use these weapon systems, that it's more likely that there's going to be an officer involved shooting. And again, at least in my opinion, maybe you disagree, but at least in my opinion, that's what we want to avoid. We want to avoid deadly force. We want to see, hey, what can we do, from the police standpoint? What can we do so there's less violence and less death? What can we do? And yes, no, I don't want people to be tased for no reason, or I don't want people to be beanbagged for no reason. Any use of force from police officers must be objectively reasonable and within the confines of the Constitution. That goes without saying, but I don't think that police officers having a restrictive use of force policy is helpful. I think it actually causes more officer-involved shootings. And I'm going to give an example from a real case that I was looking at when I was working as a use of force investigator. Let me read this comment from Charles. The beanbags have a place, but in this case, it seems like there were opportunities for de-escalation that didn't involve shotguns. He didn't have a knife or a hostage or anything. Yeah, Charles. I agree. Could they have spoke to him a little bit more? Maybe. But again, if you watch the video, I don't know. I mean, you always run the risk of, if you de-escalate and it's not working, that does he try to get back into the McDonald's? Does he run? Does he try to run into traffic? And, then if that happens, the criticism of police will be like, hey, listen, like, you had this guy, you talked to him for 8 minutes. He was obviously like out of his mind and didn't know what planet he's on. And you have these less lethal weapon systems that are literally designed to take people into custody and not kill them. And instead, you just let him run this way, and he tried to carjack someone, and then you had to shoot him. Yeah, that sounds like officer-induced jeopardy. So again, Charles, I appreciate the comments, but again, it could be argued. It could be argued a couple different ways. Though I always love de-escalation. With a guy like this, Charles, he wasn't communicating. So a lot of times when you de-escalate someone, and so when you're a police officer and you're working and someone's in a mental health crisis, there are times that you have a dialogue. So I would say if there was some kind of a dialogue, say like, hey, I'm Officer Dan with the police department, and he goes, hey, listen, I'm having a bad day, I'm this, and like, if there's any kind of a dialogue, Charles, I would say, yeah, police officers should absolutely engage with the person and talk to them as long as the person is talking. But in this case, Charles, what the body cam video shows is police officers were trying to talk to him, and he was kind of like grunting and screaming and making noises that were, for lack of a better term, like not like reasonable words. He was kind of like mumbling and yelling and swinging this thing, and there was no communication. Like, the lights weren't on in his house, whether it was mental illness or drugs. I don't have any idea. But again, I'm just going to say one last time that if police officers are having an active dialogue with someone, that, yeah, police officers shouldn't be in a hurry. I'm good with it. But this guy, there was no dialogue. He was not responsive at all to police. So here's the story that I'm going to tell. So I was working as a use of force investigator, and this wasn't my case, but the guy who sat at the next desk to me, he's a sergeant now with our police department, the next desk over, he had a case come across his desk. A lot of times when things like this happen, multiple investigators and supervisors kind of look in and see, like, okay, what do we think about this case? So here was what happened in this case, and this is a police department that had a very restricted use of force policy. Basically, they made it very difficult for police officers to utilize these less lethal weapon systems. So here was the situation. There was a woman, and she was a woman, like a 40-year-old woman. She was armed with this pipe. She had a pipe, and she was in a residential neighborhood, and she was walking down the street, and she was taking the pipe, and she was bashing in cars. She was damaging cars, bashing in cars, out of her mind, and she had this pipe. That's what she did. Police officers get there, they see all the damage. So right away, we have felony charges, right? So there's definitely felony charges. The criminal damage to property is definitely a felony level. So there's an objective. So there's a reason for police, a lawful objective. There's a reason for police officers to detain or arrest her. So now you have this woman who's armed with this pipe. You got like 4 or 5 cops there. Some of them have handguns, some of them have a beanbag shotgun, some of them have a taser. And she has this pipe, and the cops are there, and she starts walking towards the pipe, walking towards the cops holding this pipe at a pretty fast rate of speed, and they're yelling at her, and they're giving her commands, they're telling her to stop, and she gets, maybe 15 feet from the cops, and she stops. And she stops, and she just holds the pipe like this. And they're giving her commands, get on the ground, drop the pipe, things like that you would expect police officers, to say. So after a few, 30 seconds or a minute of giving her commands, one of the officers decides to utilize a taser. So he tases her. She falls to the ground, doesn't have any injuries. Officers get her into handcuffs, and she's arrested for the felony charges. So I look at that case, and I say, what? Like, no, I never want police officers to use force. But you know what? Given this situation, this is actually a pretty good outcome, because here we have someone, she committed a felony. She was armed with a pipe, which is a deadly weapon. She's armed with a deadly weapon, and police officers were able to get her into custody without injuring her, without injuring themselves. Like I'm saying, that's a win. Right? That's a win. So it gets to our office doing use of force investigation, and the detectives who watching, and he goes, hey bro, this is going to be out of policy. I go, hold on, just hang on a second. He goes, this is going to be out of policy. Basically, what that means is that it was improper for the police officer to utilize that. So out of policy. So now, if this is going to be out of policy, that means for the rest of this cop's career, on their official record, it's going to say they have a tasing, which is, a pretty serious use of force, and out of policy tasing on their record forever. That's going to affect, maybe you guys don't care, but I care about this stuff. That's going to affect the cop, especially if a cop does good, right? Because even if you don't like cops, my guess is that you want good cops, right? You want cops to resolve situations without deadly force if possible. So you also shouldn't like stuff like this, because all it does is discourage good cops from wanting to be cops. So, basically this could affect the police officer for his entire career. This could affect transfers, being promoted to a higher level, becoming an investigator. This could affect the police officer if they try to go to a different agency. They could get put on one of those lists where, they are like a Brady list or a Giglio list where they're not allowed to testify. And again, this is a situation where, and I'm not exaggerating the case, this is literally the case, but it was technically out of policy. So we go, well, hang on a second. How is this possibly out of policy? So, we all talked about it and we looked into it. And, basically, here's why. Here's what the policy said. The policy said that police officers can only utilize a taser if someone is actively resisting arrest. And you go, okay, well, then what's relevant? Well, what's the definition of active resistance? Well, basically, what active resistance is if someone is actually attacking the cop. That would be active resistance. So the fact that she was standing there holding the pipe, not doing anything, not actually advancing at the cops anymore, that was not considered active resistance. Because that wasn't considered active resistance, the police officers were not permitted to utilize a taser. So I asked the sergeant who was having this discussion with us. He's now he's gone up like 2 or 3 ranks. Really smart guy, brilliant guy. He's gone up 2 or 3 ranks since this in the police department, and I think that they're absolutely lucky to have this guy. But I was talking to him and I go, hang on, dude, hang on, Sarge. So what you're saying to me is that this is out of policy. I said, Sarge, what would happen if she started advancing towards the cops with that pipe? So she's 15 feet away, and now she's coming at the cops with a pipe. What would be the appropriate in policy level of force? And the sergeant says, well, they would have to use deadly force. And I go, exactly. So they would have to utilize deadly force. I said, so what you're saying to me is that what the police department would prefer is that police officers not utilize a taser like they did where there was no injuries. They would prefer to wait until this woman advances towards them and then shoot her. And that makes absolutely no sense to me. And I know Cage and Randy might disagree, but when you have restrictive policies like this, because again, had she taken 2 or 3 steps towards the cops, they would have shot her. At that point, when you're coming at police officers at a close distance with a pipe, less lethal tools are not appropriate because that's a deadly force situation. So my opinion is that when you have restrictive use of force policy, so basically to wrap up that case, we all basically said in the office, all of us, all the way up like 2 or 3 ranks above me, the sergeant, the LT, we all basically said, okay, from a common sense standpoint, the cop did the right thing. She wasn't injured. She was arrested. The cops weren't injured. Like objectively, just from like a common sense point of view, this officer did like the right thing. But it's technically out of policy. So that's a problem. So, and again, to the last thing I'll say on this is that it was after that case that we worked up a new policy. Finally, after about a year and a half, it got reviewed. It got approved. And now the policy with the policy with this from my former department is, as of last summer, the policy is that if someone they basically added to the definition of active resistance, if someone has a weapon, and they're not following instructions of police officers, that essentially that scenario is considered to be is considered active resistance. Cajun says multiple man can't take a pipe from a woman. Correct, Cajun Randy. There is no police training in the entire country that would say that if a man or woman is armed with a pipe, that you should try to take it from their hands. And here's why, Cajun Randy, because if I go into, me or someone else, we go to try to take a pipe from someone, if during that, if I get smacked in the face, well, that could cause serious injury or death. Now, I'm seriously injured. The cop who's next to me sees me seriously injured with my eye hanging out of my socket. What's that cop going to do? He's probably going to shoot her and utilize deadly force. And again, not everybody agrees. You may not agree, Cajun Randy, but my goal, what I want, is less deadly force from police officers. So what can we do? Yes, again, I don't want people to be tased or beanbagged unnecessarily, anything like that. But yes, I would rather have police officers tase people a little bit quicker and have them not be injured than for police officers to wait a little bit too long and have to kill someone. Because that's what I really care about. That's what I really care about. Those are my opinions. I really appreciate, Charles says, I didn't watch the video, appreciate the context. Thanks for bringing up topics like this. Enjoy your content. Thank you, Charles. And listen, I appreciate the question. Charles, on the last video, he asked a very thoughtful and reasonable question, and I appreciate it. We've actually done studies on this, and the viewers on Cop Watch TV are about 30 IQ points higher than the general public. So thank you. Let's see. Paul says, the woman had a weapon, intent and delivery system to seriously injure police officers. Good decision by police. Thank you, Paul. I agree it was. And again, so if it happened today, if this case happened to the one I'm telling you about, if it happened today, it would be considered in policy. And, maybe the cop would even be given a life-saving award. She committed a felony. She has a pipe. And police officers got her into custody with no injuries. That's fantastic. Again, like literally exactly what we want cops to do. But again, you can't get, so this cop can't go back in time and say, well, hey, like you called this shit out of policy, but like you literally changed the entire policy because of my case. It would have been fine now. Like there's no way to go back. So that's one of the, I know that's the police union guy in me, but that's a pretty irritating thing. All right, so the last case that I'm going to talk about, and I talked about this case when it first happened. I talked about this case when it first happened last year. I talked about this case when it first happened last year. It's a controversial officer-involved shooting, happened last fall, but we have body camera video from it for the first time. So up until very recently, all we had was Ring doorbell camera from across the street. And I did talk about this case when it happened. Again, it was made national news. It's been in national news the last week or so again. And essentially, this is the case of Stephen Perkins from Decatur, Alabama. There's a civil rights attorney named Lee Merritt who's trying to be like Ben Crump. He left Texas and went down to Decatur, Alabama, which he had no context to. And so the reason why I first noticed this case is because of the civil rights attorney Lee Merritt from Texas, who was basically hired to represent the family of Stephen Perkins in Decatur, Alabama. And one of the reasons why I thought this was such a strange case is there were essentially protests in the streets after this officer-involved shooting, and it's on cell phone video that someone recorded that posted. And essentially, what Lee Merritt, the civil rights attorney, the leader of some of these marches and protests, what he said is that if the officers aren't charged, we need to, and I quote, burn something down. So again, I don't think language like that is appropriate. But again, it's been, I've long said that, I think the way that, that some of these civil rights attorneys are able to, basically screw the citizens and the taxpayers out of big settlements is because, it's basically there's a threat that, hey, if you don't give us this settlement, we're going to burn down the fucking downtown. It's always been a kind of something that I thought happens. Well, now we have video of him actually saying it in this case. So let's get into the facts. Also on this case, I did some posts, a couple of posts on this case on Twitter over the past week, and I was contacted by a guy named Dale Jackson. He's a radio DJ from WVNN. He calls himself Alabama's most trusted journalist. He does local radio, local news radio in Huntsville, Alabama. He's pretty much the guy there. He reached out to me on Twitter and asked me to come on the show. So I was actually on his show. I think on a Wednesday morning, talking about this case. So that was a pretty cool experience because he's local there in Alabama, and he reached out to me to give my take on this case. So let me just explain what happened here. And this is a case where, I would say that it's more like the first case. So a lot of time people comment that I only cover officer-involved shootings where the cops did everything right. Well, again, we got two that, their cops did make mistakes. So I think the Stephen Perkins case really is pretty close to the first case that we covered with the 15-year-old in California, and here's why. So basically, here's what happened. And again, we have a lot more information because we have body camera footage, and also the 911 call has been released. So again, there's no more guessing. We know exactly what happened in this case. So here's what happened. So basically, a guy who he's a repo guy. He takes people's cars when they don't pay. So this repo guy, he went over to Stephen Perkins. Stephen Perkins, and again, Stephen Perkins, not a bad guy. From everything we know about Stephen Perkins, the one who is shot and killed by police, Stephen Perkins, from all we know, he's not a bad guy. He works a full-time job. He has a family. He had one arrest, like for a DUI 10 years before this happened. So again, I'm setting that up basically saying that Stephen Perkins, not a bad guy, not a shithead, not a career criminal, not like going out at night in the street looking for people to victimize, like not a thing at all. Stephen Perkins, a pretty reasonable guy. So what happened is that this repo guy had the repo order to basically take the truck that Stephen Perkins owned. So here's what the report is. So basically the report is that the repo guy goes over to the house, at night, like 2:00 in the morning or something like that, starts to hook up the truck. And during this, Stephen Perkins comes out, and in the words of the repo guy, Stephen Perkins flashed a gun at me. And at this point, that's all we know. We don't know if he pulled the gun out and pointed it, or if he had it in his waistband and he kind of did he kind of like just moved it so you could see that he had a gun. But, basically what police officers were told by the victim, I guess, is that, during this repo that Stephen Perkins flashed a gun at me. Well, obviously that triggers a response from police officers. So police officers went ahead and met the repo guy over at his tow yard, and they had a conversation with him. And during that conversation, police officers basically have a couple different things. So a lot of times when you're a police officer and dispatched to a call like this, and it's easier, the way I used to like to do it is to kind of separate issues, because sometimes if you have someone, especially if they're a victim of the crime, they're going to tell you 1,000 things and they're going to talk for an hour and it's not going to be relevant. So I try to get people to be on point when I'm interviewing people. So essentially what I would want to know is, okay, we have two different issues here. We have a repo. Okay, so you want to do a repo on this guy's car, and do you need police assistance for that? Like, that's one thing. The other one is, hey, this guy flashed a gun at you. Like, did you feel threatened? Do you want to press charges? And kind of going that way. So those are basically the two issues in this case. The possible aggravated assault, possible aggravated assault. I think in Alabama it's called menacing. So possible menacing, which is a strange term, possible menacing, and then also, this repo. So they had a conversation with him, and, basically what it kind of sounded like is the repo guy, he didn't give a shit about the criminal charges. He didn't want to mess around with that. All he wanted was this truck. He just wanted the truck. He wanted to do the repo, and essentially he wanted assistance from police officers. So now police officers basically have a decision to make. And this is when first line supervision in police, there is no substitute for good and competent and experienced first line supervisors. There are so many incidents that we cover on this channel, and that we see on body camera video, where if there was a good first line supervisor, you call him up, hey Sarge, and the Sarge goes, hey, what the fuck you guys doing? And no, we're gonna do this. This is what the policy says. This is law. Hey, I mean, there's no substitute for competent first line supervision, because because cops have the ability to turn civil things into criminal matters, or criminal into civil. So that's why having good first line supervisors is good. So that didn't happen in this case for whatever reason, because what the police officers ended up doing is they ended up going over to the house and essentially helping the tow truck guy with the repo. So they essentially set up all around the house, right? So they set up, so the guy's truck is in the driveway. They set up kind of on near the rear of the truck, closest to the garage. So one officer's there. There's another officer who's across the street, and they're kind of doing it in a way where it's like they're almost expecting Stephen Perkins to come out armed with a gun, which, so That's actually not an unreasonable expectation. That's what I want police officers to expect to happen. That, hey, Stephen Perkins, the first time that this car tried to be repoed, he came out at least armed with a gun. Don't know if he pointed it, but at least armed with a gun. So now, repo guy, an hour or two later, he's going to come back out and do the same thing. Like, the idea that Stephen Perkins is going to have the same reaction or an angrier reaction, like, again, that's not unreasonable. That doesn't mean that Stephen Perkins is a bad guy. I'm going to ask you whether imagine that you're a cop or imagine that you are whoever you happen to be in life. At 2 o'clock in the morning, in your mind, you've made all your car payments. For whatever reason, you've made all your car payments, and you've got a repo guy trying to take your truck at 2 o'clock in the morning without any kind of conversation. Are you going to be pissed off? Yeah. Now, should you go and point a gun at people? Well, no. You can't use lethal force to defend property. But again, the idea that Stephen Perkins was mad and upset and irritated about this, like, I get it. I get it 100%. If someone tried to do that to my car, knowing I've made my car payment, I'd be pretty irritated, and I don't know what my reaction would be. Hopefully, I wouldn't point a gun at anybody. But again, you can imagine that Stephen Perkins is mad, and the police officers should have anticipated that his reaction is going to be the same. And it seemed like they did anticipate that, because they weren't just like nonchalant, just hanging out and hanging in their cars. And be like, all right, dude, we're going to be hanging in the cars. We'll be down the block. Go ahead and do your thing. No, they like set up tactically on this house. And the repo guy, he starts to take the car. And as he's taking the car, predictably, Stephen Perkins comes out of the house. But this time he has the handgun in his hand. There is a light that is mounted on the handgun, and he's pointing it. And he's pointing the handgun, and he's pointing the handgun at police officers. There's a police officer who is standing near the rear of the truck. He's standing near the rear of the truck. There is a light mounted on the handgun, and the body cam footage shows this very clearly. Where the police officer is behind the truck, Stephen Perkins, he points the gun, and the light from the gun covers the police officer. So again, there is literally no factual dispute. The police officer had a gun pointed directly at him. The gun was pointed at him. Officer Marquette is his name. He had a gun pointed at him. As soon as the gun was pointed at Officer Marquette, Officer Marquette yelled, "Police, get on the ground," and then he started shooting. There was no gap. There was no gap. Really, if you watch the body camera video, from the time that he yelled, "Police," it was, "Police, get on the ground, shoot." There was no time. Stephen Perkins had zero time to comply with "get on the ground." Zero time. He would have had to be superhuman in order to comply with that command of "get on the ground" before he was shot by a police officer. Now, a couple things. We don't know what Stephen Perkins' intent was. So here are my questions. Did Stephen Perkins know that it was police officers? Was Stephen Perkins purposely pointing a gun at the cop? Or because it was like 3 o'clock in the morning and it was dark outside, he was using the light on the gun to basically see who it was or what was going on? Essentially, was he using the gun as a flashlight? Which, again, is a terrible idea, right? And police officers are not allowed to do that, okay? Steve Perkins is not a police officer, but was he using the gun to light up to see who it was? Did Mr. Perkins know that it was police officers? Like, these are reasonable questions. And, Stephen Perkins, he was shot by Officer Marquette. He was shot and killed by Officer Marquette, and the police officer is now facing murder charges. He's facing murder charges, and all police officers on scene, I think there were like 4 or 5 of them, they've all been fired from the department. I've got a lot of issues with this case, and I'm going to tell you exactly what those are. So my first issue with this case, the main issue with this case, is that the cops should have contacted, detained, arrested, notified, somehow made contact with Mr. Perkins before the second repo was allowed. Because, again, exactly what they thought was going to happen happened. So what I would ask if I was the administrative investigator for this case, if they did an administrative investigation, if I was the internal affairs investigator, which I worked in internal affairs for a couple years, here's one of the questions that I would ask. I would say, okay, so you had this repo. Mr. Perkins, he at least had a gun. It seems like you kind of thought he was going to come out with a gun again because you set up tactically on the house. Hey, what was your plan when Mr. Perkins came out with the gun? What was your plan? Was your plan just to shoot him? Was your plan to give him commands? Like, what was the thinking? What was the plan when he came out with a gun? You knew he was going to come out with a gun. What was the plan? That would be my question for those officers, because there wasn't a plan. The idea that, and again, police officers do not have to get involved in civil matters. So police officers do not have to help out with a repo. They could have told the repo guy, hey, listen, like, you don't want to press charges on Mr. Perkins. Great. But listen, it's nighttime. It's a dangerous situation. So listen, here's what you're going to do. We're not going to go out with you because it's a dangerous situation for something civil. We're cops. We don't enforce civil law. That repo order, we're not getting involved. I'm not going to interpret that. I'm not a notary. I don't know what I'm looking for on this. And that would be a correct thing for a police officer to say, to not take sides in a civil dispute, only to keep the peace. It would be reasonable for officers to say, hey, listen, you have your officer manager, call him tomorrow, and like, you try to work it out that way, but like we're not getting involved in this. That would be the reasonable thing for police officers to say. They didn't. They decided to help him out with the repo, fine, but they should have contacted Mr. Perkins beforehand. It's absolutely insane that they didn't. Essentially, this is a very predictable situation that Mr. Perkins is going to come out with a gun, and again, they had no plan for it. That's my biggest problem with this case. That being said, I just went through a lot of my problems with this case. That being said, I don't think the officer should be facing criminal charges. That doesn't make any sense, because at the time of the shooting, no matter what police officers did before, and again, Officer Marquette, he wasn't the sergeant on scene. He wasn't the supervisor. So again, he had a gun pointed at him. And it's not just him saying that and it's kind of fishy. No. We have body camera video that shows the light from Mr. Perkins' gun covering the officer. He literally had a gun pointed at him when he fired at Mr. Perkins. Again, if that is not a reasonable response from a police officer, you point a gun at me, now I'm going to shoot. It's not like, hey, we thought Mr. Perkins had a gun, or he had it in his pocket and he kind of reached for it, or he had it in his hand and we thought he was going to move it up. No. Like, again, we are past the red line. The gun is pointed at Officer Marquette, and yes, he said, police, get on the ground, and then he shot. I think that is an objectively reasonable officer-involved shooting, despite all of the problems that I just said. And there were problems in this case. I got a lot of issues with this case. But the actual moment that the trigger was pulled, yeah, it was objectively reasonable. Again, if you don't think it was objectively reasonable, I'm going to ask you, what police training is there that would say, hey, when a gun is pointed at you, you have to negotiate. Like, you can't respond. Like there's literally no, and if there's no state-mandated police training that would say that. So if there's nothing that would tell a police officer that, holding police officers to that level, it doesn't make any sense. So when I was on the show, Dale Jackson's show, he basically asked me a couple, like really good questions. The question that Dale Jackson asked me, he said, so police officers, do they have to give a warning? Like, do they have to give a warning before they utilize deadly force? And I thought, God damn, that's a good question. Well, the answer is no. Police officers don't. Now, should police officers give a warning? Yeah, they should, if feasible. So most police department policy is going to say you should give a warning if feasible. We talked about a case the earlier today with the beanbag shotgun, where I said the officers gave commands and warnings to Mr. Rios before they used the taser and the beanbag shotgun. Hey, stop or I'm going to tase you. Hey, stop or you're going to get beanbagged. Yeah, that's great if there's a time to do it. Now, in that case, Mr. Rios was at a distance and he was swinging a belt. The cops weren't in immediate danger. When someone is pointing a gun at you, like the time to negotiate and give warnings, like that time has passed, because your life may have only moments left to it. So yes, police officers are not required by policy or law to give a warning when someone is pointing a gun at them. That is not a requirement, and it shouldn't be a requirement. Yes, if police officers have time and it's reasonable, absolutely, give all the warnings, de-escalate if you can. When the gun is pointed at you, the time for de-escalation has passed. That was a really good question by Mr. Jackson. The other question he asked, he said, hey, what do you think? Should the officers be fired? Should the officers be fired for what they did in this case? And that was also an interesting question. So I guess my opinion on that is, if the police officers violated policy. So if there is policy, and I don't know the Decatur, Alabama Police Department, did they have policy or training on how to handle a situation like this. Like a lot of police departments have policies that says, hey, if there's a civil dispute, here's how you guys handle it. If there's a call, or they may have a policy that says, hey, if there's a call for service where there's reported to be a gun or someone is armed, or like these are the protocols that you take. Here's the policy, here's the training. So if that was in effect with Decatur Police Department and there's a fair investigation, if at the end of the investigation it's determined that the police officers violated policy, then I really don't have any issue with termination being on the table for this case, at least for the officer who was in charge. Here's what I'm saying. I don't know if there was a sergeant on scene. Let's say that there was a sergeant on scene and 3 regular cops, and the sergeant on scene says, all right, guys, here's what we're going to do. You go here, you go here, you go here. Well, again, the officer who has 2 years on, listening to the sergeant who has 10 years on, and the sergeant says, hey, go stand over there by the back of the truck. Like, no, that officer shouldn't be fired. The sergeant, sure. Or, whoever was in charge of that scene. Yeah, I don't have an issue with officers being terminated if they made that decision. But again, it's not criminal. I also I was contacted by, I don't know if anybody follows Officer Ben. He runs a channel called Thoughts of a Police Officer on YouTube and Instagram. Me and Ben go back and forth all the time. And, he reached out to me this morning asking me about this case, and we're kind of going back and forth. And, what Ben pointed out to me is he said, okay, well, here's where I think an issue could be on this case. Officer Ben said, well, after Mr. Perkins was on the ground. He was on the ground. He was shot. He dropped the gun. Like he's done for, right? He's obviously not a threat anymore. The officer, Marquette, he fired a bunch more shots at him. Like, what do we think? Is that going to be an issue? And again, that's a really good question. I don't think so. I don't think it's going to be an issue, and here's why. So we've had this with other cases, right, where police officers, shoot, 90 times. And I'm not exaggerating on that. There was a case in Minnesota last year involving an individual named Jalen Walker who had previously shot at police officers. He reached into his waistband and started turning around, and police officers, 8 different cops, fired 90 times, hitting him 46 times. And this was in Minnesota, not necessarily a police-friendly place. All those officers were cleared. And basically what I said in that case is what I'm going to say in this case. It's basically, how many shots that were fired isn't really that relevant. Here's what's relevant. The first shot that was fired, was that shot reasonable, legal? Can we see why the officer did that? If the first shot is justified, then, the subsequent shots, not as relevant. Now, obviously, if it goes on for 10 seconds, well, that's a different story, and that didn't happen here. But again, if someone is no longer a threat and the officer fires a couple more shots, like, that's not that unreasonable. And here's why it's not that unreasonable. And if I were the attorney for Officer Marquette, who is facing murder charges in this case, basically, here's the information that I would try to get to the jury. I would basically, if the issue of too many shots, like, hey, he's no longer a threat, here, we're going to play it in slow motion. Even though in real life it was like 2.5 seconds, we're going to play it in slow motion so it takes 18 seconds. And look, he just keeps firing. So basically, here's what I would say if I were the attorney for Officer Marquette. I would say, okay, listen, here's how this goes. So when you're in a stressful situation, and we've done science on this, we can have experts testify, when you're in a stressful situation like this, we know how the human body performs. Essentially, from the time that the officer sees, or any human, but we'll say an officer because that's what he is, from the time the officer can see, hey, there's no more threat, the brain has to process that, and that has to tell the body. That takes about 1.5 seconds. So it takes about 1.5 seconds for a normal human under stress to realize there's no more threat, stop shooting. That takes 1.5 seconds. So how many times on average do police officers fire every second? And the answer is 4. Police officers typically can fire about 4 times a second. So a police officer under perfect conditions, like perfectly functioning police officer in this situation would fire 6 extra shots. So again, if Officer Marquette was perfect, like 100% perfect, we should expect 6 extra shots being fired. So how many extra shots were fired? I think it was like 6 or 8 or something like that. So again, it's one of those things that it doesn't look great on body camera footage, but if you know just a tiny bit about this kind of a situation, that police officers aren't robots, and like the exact millisecond instant that Stephen Perkins dropped the gun, that the officer can just stop. No, it takes the human body about 1.5 seconds to make that change. Let's see if we have any questions on this case. Oh, it doesn't look like we do. Well, we'll go ahead and keep following the Stephen Perkins case because the officer's firing the officer is facing murder charges. I do not think the officer should be facing charges. I think it's pretty ridiculous. And you know what? That's going to be the last case that we go ahead and cover today. So, as I've said before, throughout the week I check the chat. So if there are other cases you think are interesting that you want us to cover, you want to have a discussion about, definitely put it in the chat throughout the week. That being said, if you haven't already, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you share it with friends and family. And again, my name's Daniel. You can go ahead and follow me everywhere over at Police Law News. And I hope that everyone has a great and safe weekend. Thanks.